Hey, it's Andrew back here at BTO Range in Conroe, Texas, and today on the bench, a little bit newer or more recent shotgun than what we normally talk about, but it does give us the opportunity to talk about some lineage. This is a Remington SP10, 10 gauge semi-automatic shotgun. They were produced by Remington from 1989 through 2010. And you really can't start talking about the SP10 shotgun without revisiting the Ithaca Mag 10, which was the Ithaca 10 gauge semi-auto shotgun that was produced from 1975 through 1989. In '89, Remington bought the rights and the pattern and the intellectual property regarding the Mag 10, redesigned it, and produced this shotgun. And we'll talk about some of the differences in those two in just a second. But when we talk about 10 gauge shotguns, it was really an Ithaca thing. Ithaca and Winchester teamed up in the early 30s, about 1932, to introduce the 10 gauge shotgun, and it's been chambered in double shotguns, both the Ithaca brand, and then even on into the 60s and 70s. There were Spanish brands like A&A that produced 10 gauge 3.5-inch Magnum shotguns. But Ithaca introduced the Mag 10 in 75, and they made a few different versions of it, mainly geared toward the hunting platform. They did make a gun called the Road Blocker, the Ithaca Mag 10 Road Blocker, which was either a 20 or a 22-inch barrel, designed for law enforcement. Didn't say Road Blocker anywhere on the gun, but it was just a configuration. That's what it was called. And the advertising hype at the time around that law enforcement gun is that you could stop a car with it. Probably not, but that was the advertising hype of the day. And 10 gauge has never really been a super popular gauge. The 12 gauge has always been the king of the hill. But for the waterfowl hunters and turkey hunters in the days of lead shot, the 10 gauge was used quite a bit because it just carried more payload and you could deliver hits further. And we'll talk about some of, and the 10 gauge, by the way, now the 10 gauge is almost completely dead. The last, at least major manufacturer of 10 gauge shotguns was Browning, with the Browning BPS slide action 10 gauge and the Browning Gold 10 semi-auto. And those are both discontinued in 2024, this year, 2024. So that should probably put the last stake in the heart of the 10 gauge. There's a small niche group of waterfowlers that still like the 10 gauge. The 12 gauge 3.5-inch Magnum has pretty much taken all the wind out of the 10 gauge sails, but there are some differences that we'll get to. But so let's talk about what Remington did differently with this gun. If you have an SP10, there are still parts available for it. It is not a Mag 10 rebranded. Let's straighten that out. It's not just an Ithaca Mag 10 with a different roll mark on it. There are some significant differences. There are some parts that do interchange between the SP10 and the Ithaca Mag 10, but a lot of parts do not. The barrels do not readily interchange. There is some talk, depending on what form you read, that a barrel can be made to interchange. It's going to require new inletting in the forend. It's going to require a different bolt swap. The bolts are different. The bolt buffer behind the bolt is different. In the SP10, the barrel's different. The stocks are different. The trigger group is different. So the gas system and the action spring are the same as the Mag 10. So it's the same gas cylinder, same gas piston, same action spring. So they took a lot of the stuff from the Mag 10 and then they made it Remington. For example, the hammer spring and a lot of the internals in this trigger group are the same as you would find in an 870 or things of that nature. So they Remingtonized it, if you will. So this particular gun, this SP10, I don't have a good solid date of manufacture on it. The date codes are not present on the barrel. And Remington did that between August of '99 and October of 2001. So it's going to be made sometime in that time period. Now it does have a J-lock safety, and that was introduced 2002-ish. So 2001 is probably a very solid estimate of a manufacture date on this shotgun, simply from a combination of the features there. Now, I have not called Remington with the serial number to try to track that down. I don't know that the current Remington company would be different than this company here. I don't know if those records or charts even still exist in their system. They might, they very well might, but then again, they might not. So anyway, it's not that big a deal. 2001 is probably a very solid guess within a year or two as to when this particular shotgun was made. So this is a 26-inch barrel gun in 10 gauge 3.5-inch Magnum, and this has a Pattern Master choke tube in it. Of course, these came set up for the rim choke tubes in 10 gauge, obviously. So there are still choke tubes being made. Carlson's apparently does not, but Colonial does, and then Pattern Master does, Briley does, and there's probably a few other choke tube manufacturers, specialty choke tube manufacturers, that are making tubes for the 10 gauge. So if you have an SP10, one thing to note is that their first year of production, 1989, the gun was considered, the story is, the gun was considered to be a limited edition gun, and they have an LE serial number prefix for 1989. I have not seen an LE numbered gun that didn't barrel code to 89. It might well occur. I haven't seen it. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But after that, the RM prefix throughout the rest of the production of the gun, this gun included, would be an RM serial prefix on the serial number of the SP10 shotgun. So Wolf Springs makes a Mag 10 spring kit, and then the action spring is the same for the Mag 10 and the SP10. So if you have one of these guns and it's been shot a bit, the action spring is probably a good spring to change. They are still available both as a aftermarket from Wolf, and then I think Midwest Gunworks has action springs as well as Gun Parts Corp or Numerous has action springs for these SP10s. So let's talk about why the 10 gauge is kind of going away. The 10 gauge has been, it was in lead shot. It was there's still a lot of shooters at 10 gauge, but back in 87, 88, when steel shot first became mandated, by 1991 nationwide, steel shot was mandated for waterfowl, and the 10 gauge really had a bit of a resurgence during that time period because you can put more. It takes a bigger pellet of steel to have the lethality of a smaller pellet in lead. I guess it's probably not. I mean, that's why there's T shot and triple B shot in steel. And if you're going to shoot what you would shoot with 4 lead, you would shoot with 2 steel. I mean, that's been a long-standing deal. So you can put more big pellets in the bigger 10 gauge 3.5-inch shell than you could the 12 gauge. Another big the 10 gauge got a reputation. I think it's pretty much been proven that at distance, say greater than 40 yards, the 10 gauge has a little bit better patterning capability because the shot string is smaller, so the pattern density is typically better. The larger bore, the .775 bore of the 10 gauge versus the .729 bore of the 12 gauge allows for a shorter shot string, so the shot string isn't spread out as far as it is on the 12 gauge gun, regardless of whether it's 3 inch or 3.5 inch. So that gave the 10 gauge a little bit of a new lease on life, when steel shot became mandated. Waterfowlers were saying, okay, I can still do a 50-yard shot on geese using the 10 gauge gun as opposed to a 12 3.5. And then shot shells evolved yet again with bismuth and tungsten and the other non-toxic shot, non-lead bearing shot that were you were once again able to use the smaller pellets, I guess. So the 12 gauge 3.5 not only caught up to the 10 gauge but surpassed the 10 gauge. The cost of 10 gauge shells is still much higher than 12 gauge, even in the exotic tungsten or bismuth loadings. So that's another issue. Now, the 12 gauge 3.5 inch is also loaded, is able to be loaded to a higher pressure. The SA-AMI loadings is right at 14,000 PSI for the 12 gauge 3.5, not quite as much for the 10 gauge 3.5. So the 12 gauge 3.5s are, especially with the non-toxic shot where you get an adequate amount of pellets in the shell, the performance is very close to the 10 gauge with the possible exception of the length of the shot string and the ability to pattern well at distances with larger shot at beyond 40 yards. So there's still an advantage to 10 gauge, but it's a very small one. It's a very niche kind of deal. So people that are 10 gauge aficionados, 10 gauge shooters, more power to you. In my opinion, there should be, you should absolutely keep shooting 10 gauges. Ammunition is still available out there. The guns are what's going to be hard to find now because there's just not enough demand for the big manufacturers to start doing that. So, and now with all the buffered exotic 3.5 inch 12 gauge shells. Now, one thing else is this gun here, this particular gun weighs 10 pounds 7 ounces. As opposed to an aluminum alloy receiver. If you took a Benelli Super Black Eagle out and you shot I don't know, 4 or 5 boxes of shells through it. At the end of the day, you're going to feel like you've shot a bunch of 3.5 inch Magnum 12 gauge shells. So actual recoil on these 10 gauge gas guns is, for me anyway, for my, whoops, I probably made noise doing that. But for me, the recoil impulse on this 10 gauge semi-auto is less than a 3.5 inch 12 gauge semi-auto. Now, if you flip that around, and you're shooting one of those 12 gauge side-by-side doubles from 50 years ago, they are pretty profound in recoil. You know you've shot something. And then there was the Marlin 5510. They called it the Super Goose 36-inch barrel bolt gun in 10 gauge. There was a ton of recoil associated with that gun also, but not so much with the gas guns. And the two most recent auto loaders were the SP10 and the Browning Gold. And there are aficionados of both. A lot of people have said that the Browning Gold patterned higher than the Remington did. I think that's more of an individual stock fit issue. So what would you expect to spend for one of these guns? Well, they're all discontinued now. So let's take a look at it based on the three aspects we always look at: the originality, scarcity, and condition. So scarcity, they're not particularly scarce. They're relatively recent, right? So there hasn't been a ton of attrition out there. Parts are still available, so they can still be fixed. So they're not terribly scarce. They can be regionally scarce depending on the amount of waterfowl hunters, goose hunters in your area. There is a small contingent of turkey hunters that have been using 10 gauge forever, but the trend that we're seeing, at least with turkey hunters, is actually smaller than 12 gauge, going into the 20 gauge and even the sub gauge turkey hunters. With, again, the exotic loading and the high-performance shot shell, the TSS loads, they're getting plenty of performance out of those 20-gauge TSS shotgun shells, and certainly 12-gauge TSS shotgun shells, that they're just not using the 10-gauge. They're not carrying that 10.5-pound gun in the field anymore. So that said, they can be regionally scarce, but they're not scarce just on the market as of yet. So originality on this gun, with the exception of this aftermarket choke tube, which is neither here nor there, it's all correct. It's got the Remington mark pad on the back. This is correct for this submodel. They did make this gun in some camo versions and different barrel lengths, but this is the standard Remington SP10 Magnum with the phosphate type finish, or the express type finish, if you will. You see this on the 870 and 1100 express guns. 26-inch barrel with the ivory, just not real ivory, but ivory style Bradley type bead and a mid bead here, and the wooden stock. So it's all original. There hasn't been any modifications done to it. So there are no receiver extensions on either the Ithaca Mag 10 or the SP10. So it's going to be a standard 3-shot gun, so 2 in 1. And now we look at condition. So a lot of these guns, especially if you're buying the gun from a 10-gauge hunter, they've been in the goose blind, they've been in the duck blind, they've been used as a paddle, or there's all kind of issues to look at. And we always look at on Remington, we look at this junction here at the back of the gun from the stock and the pad to see if there's any finish lifting, especially on the polyurethane style finish. There's none here. We still have the Remington pad in place. We're not cracked here through the stock. We have checkering's not damaged, so we're in good shape on the wood. No cracks in the forend. This collar sometimes gets loose, so we're still okay there. There's no significant surface rust coming up on this phosphate finish at all, and mechanically we're still good here. So this is they're usually found in good condition, to be honest with you. They're either usually found in good condition or really, really bad condition. There's never a middle ground on these guns, at least from the ones that I've seen, and that applies to the Mag 10 as well. So, and for that matter, the Brownings. But you can still find, the Brownings have been in line up until very recently, so they're still new in the box. Browning BPS 10 gauge and Browning Gold 10 that can be found at various retailers around the country. I'm sure there's still items in inventory that haven't been sold through yet, but there won't be any more of those. So we're okay with all of that, scarcity, originality, and condition. So the Mag 10s, especially the Roadblocker series, have become somewhat collectible. They could be greater than $1,000 pretty easily. The SP10 typically doesn't, is almost always sub $1,000. In that $700–800 range is typically where this gun lives. If you find them, and the different models, the different submodels, the camo can add a little bit of money. It's never a ton of money, but if you can find them for sub $700, it's certainly a good buy on an SP10 in good shape. I don't know that they'd pull $1,000. That said, if you bought one for $1,000 and you like it, more power to you. And shoot it and enjoy it, have fun with it. The Brownings, simply because they had a higher price going in and they're still relatively new, they'll probably bring a little bit more money on the used market, especially a boxed unit. So the 12 gauge 3.5 inch shell guns, that started in 1988. That's when Mossberg and Federal teamed up for that 3.5 inch shell, and they brought out the Mossberg 835 Ultimag, which was the first pump gun. And then 3 years later in 91, Benelli did the Super Black Eagle 3.5 inch. So that was kind of the end of the day between the 3.5 inch 12 gauge and the non-toxic, non-steel shot available that we see currently available, and all that combined together just pretty much killed off the 10 gauge. But that said, for those shooters that are shooting that 10 gauge, and there are plenty that like it, and they still say that at 50–60 yards the 10 gauge is going to outperform the 12 3.5, and they're probably right. They'll put more more pellets in the pattern than the typical 3.5 inch 12. So there's room still for the 10 gauge, but unfortunately there's just not enough demand, and the manufacturers, it just did not, or has ceased to be a profitable gauge or profitable gun for them to put out. So anyway, the Remington SP10, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We appreciate you watching our videos on this channel. Hit that notification bell. We've got new stuff coming out, or different stuff. We don't do much new stuff on this channel. We're going to start to try to do a little bit more new product offering stuff. But every week we try to post new videos at least. So we appreciate you watching this one, and we'll see you on the next one.